In the small town of Ashford, lost among the hills of Virginia, life flowed smoothly and calmly. Here everyone knew each other, and the local St. Mark's Church, located in the very center, was not just a place of worship, but the heart of the entire community. It was here that Ashford residents came to find solace, share joy, or simply hear the kind words of Father Daniel McKinnon, a priest who had served in the town for over a decade. Father Daniel was a man to whom advice was sought, and his words were often decisive in matters both spiritual and temporal. But it is his unyielding outlook on life and belief in his own infallibility that will soon become the center of a terrible scandal that will shake Ashford to its very foundations. Maria Grayson, a 30-year-old woman with a heart of gold, was one of the most devoted members of the church. Everyone knew her, from the children for whom she organized Sunday lessons to the elderly whom she helped around the house. Maria was that rare person who always found time for others, forgetting about her own needs. Her bright smile and kind eyes became a symbol of kindness in this small town. But no one could have imagined that it was in this church, among the walls saturated with prayers and hopes, that an event would occur that would make everyone doubt what they know about life and death, good and evil. One day, at the beginning of a cold October, Maria suddenly disappeared. She was not seen either at Sunday services or in the city park, where she usually walked with neighboring children. Phone calls went unanswered, and her home appeared to be hastily abandoned. This caused alarm among residents, and within a few days the search began. No one expected that Mary would be found dead, much less in the holiest place in the city. But this was only the beginning of a long and painful story that will reveal the dark sides of the human soul and force the city of Ashford to face a truth from which it is impossible to hide, even behind the walls of the church. It all started with a body found in a quiet, darkened parish room, the body of Maria Grayson. Her death was not just a tragedy, it was a brutal murder, committed with such cold determination that no one could believe that the man to whom they trusted their deepest secrets was behind it. The investigation of this crime was supposed to destroy trust and destroy lives. But until this moment, before everything became known, the residents of Ashford still believed that evil could not penetrate their quiet corner. However, with each passing hour, with each new discovery by detectives, it became clear that true evil can hide even in the most righteous hearts. Thus began a story that shook the city to its core, and soon every resident of Ashford realized no one is safe from the darkness hidden behind the mask of holiness. A cold autumn wind blew through the streets of Ashford, stripping the last leaves from the trees. It seemed like a normal day, a bustling market, children playing in the schoolyard, and the sound of bells echoing in the empty alleys. But something was wrong. There was tension in the air, subtle but persistent, as if nature itself was warning of impending disaster. In the morning hours, when the city was just waking up, Lisa Carter timidly knocked on the door of St. Mark's Church. She came, as she did every Sunday, to help Father Daniel prepare the church for the service. Usually Maria was already here at this time, tending to flowers or arranging candles, but today the church greeted Lisa with silence. A strange, dull silence that spread across the empty benches and dimmed the light in the stained glass windows. Lisa called Maria. Her voice echoed throughout the empty hall, but there was no answer. At first she decided that her friend was simply delayed, but slight anxiety gradually began to develop into fear. Her intuition told her that something was wrong. This feeling did not leave her as she walked through the dark corridors of the church, heading towards the rooms where the priest and parishioners usually held conversations. It was there, in a small room closed to parishioners, that Lisa discovered something that was to change her life forever. The light of the lamp, barely breaking through the half-open door, snatched a terrifying sight from the darkness. On the floor, among scattered books and papers, lay the body of Maria Grayson. Lisa did not immediately understand what was in front of her. It was too unexpected, too unimaginable. Maria's body was mutilated beyond recognition, and the first thing Lisa felt was not fear, but an inexplicable emptiness, as if reality had suddenly lost its meaning. She screamed, but her scream was drowned in the walls of the church. Time seemed to stand still. The thought that her friend was dead did not immediately penetrate her consciousness. At that moment, Lisa could not understand how and who could commit such an atrocity. Maria's body was covered with bloody marks, and her face was so disfigured that she could only be recognized by her clothes and jewelry. But this horror was not the only thing that shocked Lisa. Behind Mary's body, a little to the side on the floor, lay a bloody cross, a symbol of the fact that the church, which they considered a refuge, had now become a place of murder. This was not just an act of violence, it was a message, dark and merciless, thrown into the very heart of faith and trust. Soon the police arrived at the scene. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the hallways as they examined the body and crime scene. There were more questions than answers. Who could commit such a brutal crime in a place that was supposed to be holy? And why Maria? Allison Harper, a detective known for her keen intelligence and professionalism, took on this case, feeling that it would be one of the most difficult of her career. Allison immediately noticed some oddities. Firstly, the crime scene seemed too clean, despite all its brutality. There were no signs of a struggle, which was strange given the state of Maria's body. In addition, her personal belongings were in place, which ruled out the possibility of robbery. Everything indicated that the killer knew Maria and acted with cold-blooded confidence. Looking around the room, Allison noticed scattered books and papers. Many of them were of religious content, and everything indicated that Mary was often in this room. But what made her come here on that fateful day? Perhaps she met someone she trusted but who turned on her. While the forensics team collected evidence, Allison began to analyze possible motives. This murder did not appear to be random. On the contrary, it seemed carefully planned and symbolic, as if the killer wanted to send some kind of message. But what exactly did he want to say? The city was shocked by the news of the brutal murder. Residents could not believe that something so terrible could happen in their quiet corner, where people always left their doors unlocked and greeted each other with smiles. The church, which has always been a symbol of light and hope, is now covered in the shadow of fear and suspicion. Allison understood that a long and difficult path to the truth awaited her. This murder was supposed to be just the beginning, the very catalyst that would bring out the dark secrets hidden behind the facade of decency and faith. And she was ready to plunge into this darkness to find answers to the questions that now tormented all of Ashford. With the first rays of the sun breaking through the thick curtain of clouds, Ashford woke up in a completely different reality. The murder of Maria Grayson was a shock that ran through every home, every family in the city. Rumors spread with lightning speed. Each resident seemed to know more than his neighbor and added his own version of events. However, at the center of all the talk and speculation was one question: who could commit such a terrible crime? Meanwhile, for detectives Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway, this morning was no different from any other, if not for the terrible events that unfolded the day before. Allison, barely closing her eyes after a sleepless night, was already sitting in the office, looking through forensic reports and looking for any detail that could shed light on this case. Mark, although he looked calm, felt internal tension. In the city where they both spent more than 1 year, murder was so rare that each case became special, but this one turned out to be simply out of the ordinary. The first thing that struck Allison when examining the reports was that there were no signs of a struggle. This meant that Maria either trusted her killer or was caught off guard. However, she was even more surprised by the condition of the body. The injuries inflicted indicated that the crime had been committed with particular cruelty. Forensic investigators discovered that the murder weapon, a knife, was left at the crime scene. This seemed unusual, since most killers try to get rid of the weapon in order to complicate the investigation. But this criminal seemed to want to leave a message, and that was what bothered Allison the most. Mark, meanwhile, was collecting information about Mary. Her life seemed at first glance impeccable. A loving family, active participation in the life of the city, devotion to the church. But Mark knew that behind the facade of perfection there are often hidden secrets that can shed light on true motives. He began by interrogating her relatives, friends, and acquaintances, trying to build a complete portrait of her life in her last days. Many described Maria as kind and sympathetic, but some hinted at her recent withdrawal and anxiety, which she seemed to hide from everyone. Mark's first interrogation led him to Lisa Carter, Maria's friend who discovered her body. Lisa was in shock and still couldn't believe what had happened. However, overcoming her emotions, she told Mark that in recent weeks Maria had become more withdrawn, often lost in her thoughts, and even avoided discussing church matters, which had previously been her favorite topic. Lisa noticed that Maria began to come to church alone late in the evening when there was no one there, and something was bothering her, but she never shared what it was. Allison, meanwhile, decided to focus on the crime scene itself. She understood that the key to the solution could be hidden in little things that at first glance might seem insignificant. Father Daniel McKinnon volunteered to help her with the examination, and although his help was offered with the best intentions, something about his behavior seemed unnatural to Allison. The priest was unnaturally calm for a man who knew the murdered woman personally and saw her body in such a terrible state. This caught Allison's attention, and she decided to take a closer look at it. Father Daniel was a man with a complex character. He was strict but fair, and although his faith was undoubted, sometimes there were notes in his sermons that alarmed some parishioners. He was a strict adherent and followed the canons with a rigidity that could seem intimidating. Allison decided it was worth looking into his past and seeing if there were events in his life that could shed light on the current investigation. Among the documents Allison studied were many church books and records, but one of them caught her attention: the journal that Maria kept. This diary was not only a record of her thoughts, but also a testimony of her experiences in the last weeks before her death. There were notes about her doubts, internal torment, and fears. One of the last entries spoke of a man in the dark who haunted her even in church, and this alarmed Allison even more. Meanwhile, Mark learned that the priest was the only one who did not provide a clear alibi for the night of the murder. He claimed that he was in church, praying, but no one could confirm his words. This further increased suspicions in his direction, but there was no direct evidence yet. Allison and Mark began to realize that the investigation was just beginning, and that there were many secrets ahead that they would have to uncover. The key moment was the realization that behind the facade of a quiet town there are many skeletons, and Maria's murder may be just the tip of the iceberg. Every step, every new piece of evidence brought more and more questions, and although the answers were not yet available, the detectives were determined to get to the bottom of the truth. The foggy morning found Ashford immersed in anxious anticipation. The murder of Maria Grayson became the main topic of conversation on the streets, in shops, and even in homes. In a town where the priest was the embodiment of moral principles and spiritual guidance, doubts now began to creep in. People whispered that perhaps something dark and terrible was hidden behind the facade of piety. Father Daniel McKinnon, who had always been a bastion of calm and confidence, now found himself under suspicion. His behavior after the murder raised more and more questions. Even those who had previously considered him the steadfast leader of the community began to notice changes. He became more withdrawn, avoided communication, and seemed to become increasingly lost in his own thoughts. Detectives Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway began to carefully study the priest's past. They knew that behind each mask there could be something hiding that explained current events. Research into his life led them to amazing discoveries. Daniel McKinnon was born and raised in a strict religious family. From a very early age he was prepared for service in the church, and he was brought up in the spirit of unquestioning obedience to religious canons. His parents, men of iron will and uncompromising convictions, instilled in him strict moral principles that guided his life. But the deeper the detectives delved into his past, the more details emerged that contradicted his impeccable image. Mark found information that Daniel served in another diocese for several years before ending up in Ashford. In those years of his service, not everything was smooth either. Several parishioners complained about his excessive severity and harsh methods of raising children in the church school. One of these complaints even led to an investigation. But the matter was hushed up and Daniel was simply transferred to another parish. Allison, in turn, began to study his behavior in recent months. What caught her attention was that several people who had previously been close to Daniel gradually began to distance themselves from him. She spoke with Amelia Ross, the church secretary who knew Daniel best. Amelia was a devoted servant and always supported the priest, but recently she noticed that he had become more withdrawn and irritable. Amelia also mentioned the strange conversation she overheard between Daniel and Maria. These conversations, she said, were intense, but she could not understand their essence. Allison and Mark also noted that Daniel was the last person to see Mary in the church on the day of her death. He claimed that they were discussing church matters, and Maria seemed a little worried, but that was the end of their conversation. However, Daniel's testimony did not match the timeline of events. Several witnesses claimed to have seen him leaving the church much later than he claimed. Allison began to realize that Daniel may not be who he says he is. His connection with Mary turned out to be much deeper than just the relationship between a priest and a parishioner. In her diary, which Allison found earlier, there were references to a man in black who often visited her in church and tried to convince her of something. These notes became increasingly disturbing as the day of her death approached. She wrote that she felt trapped and did not know how to get out of the current situation. However, so far there has been no direct evidence of the priest's guilt. His alibi, although it seemed dubious, still could not be disproved. But Allison and Mark knew they had to dig deeper. The question was not only who killed Maria, but also why it happened. What did Mary know that could make the priest or someone from his circle commit such a terrible crime? Meanwhile, the residents of Ashford began to suspect that the matter might be more complicated than they thought. More and more people began to move away from the church, feeling that their faith had been undermined. It wasn't just a crisis of faith. It was the realization that the man they trusted could be hiding a horrifying secret. Suspicions and fears began to eat away at the calm of the city, turning it from a quiet corner into a place where anyone could be a suspect. Allison and Mark decided to focus on the evidence to avoid making a mistake. They understood that they could deal with a person who skillfully hides his true intentions. But the truth always comes out, and they were determined to find out what really happened on that fateful day when Maria Grayson was killed. As detectives continued to delve deeper into the case, the atmosphere in Ashford became increasingly tense every day. The city, once calm and friendly, now seemed immersed in a fog of suspicion and mistrust. The murder of Maria Grayson and suspicions about Father Daniel McKinnon turned the community into a place where anyone could become the target of rumors. Conversations began with innocent questions, which quickly escalated into heated discussions and ultimately into accusations. In a local cafe where residents gathered to discuss the latest news, the topic of murder became the main topic. Someone remembered seeing Maria late in the evening near the church. Others mentioned strange changes in the behavior of Father Daniel. Everything seemed important, even the smallest details, and everyone considered it their duty to share information that could shed light on the crime. One of the most discussed topics was the connection between Mary and the priest. Many knew that Maria spent a lot of time in the church, often helped with organizing events, and was close to Father Daniel. But now, after her murder, this closeness began to seem suspicious. People began to wonder what exactly connected them. Was it just a spiritual connection or something more? Amelia Ross, the church secretary, was also drawn into this whirlpool of rumors. She was the only one who worked side by side with Father Daniel every day, and the villagers began to suspect that she might know something, but she remained silent. Some even suggested that she could be involved in the murder, since she was always nearby and knew all the internal affairs of the parish. Allison and Mark, realizing that rumors could not only fuel interest in the case, but also complicate the investigation, decided to begin a series of meetings with local residents. Their goal was not only to gather more information, but also to try to calm tensions in the community. However, they quickly realized that stopping the flow of gossip would not be easy. At one of these meetings, they ran into John Miller, a local journalist who had been actively covering the investigation. He seemed to know everything about the detective's every move and willingly shared his thoughts with anyone who would listen. John was sure that there was more to the matter than just jealousy or personal scores. He even suggested that the murder could be connected to dark rituals or ancient rites that the priest allegedly performed in secret. Allison, although skeptical, realized that John could have important information, especially if he was communicating with people who were afraid to speak directly to the police. She decided to take note of some of his assumptions, although she did not consider them paramount. Meanwhile, Mark focused on interrogating members of the church parish. He noticed that many of them who had previously supported Daniel's father were now starting to distance themselves from him. Some parishioners even admitted that they felt uncomfortable during the last sermons, when the priest spoke about sin and redemption with special passion, almost with a threat. These words began to seem to them like a harbinger of something terrible, and now they could not help feeling that there was a hidden threat in his words. But the most surprising thing was that some of the most devoted parishioners began to doubt their faith. They could not understand how the person to whom they trusted their souls could be involved in such a terrible crime. These doubts penetrated their hearts and began to destroy the foundations on which their whole life rested. At the same time, Lisa Carter, Maria's friend, who remained one of the few who still believed in the innocence of Father Daniel, became the object of condemnation from her neighbors. Her faith in the priest seemed absurd in the eyes of those who had already condemned him for his crime, and Lisa began to feel cold alienation from those whom she considered friends. Her support for the priest began to seem strange, and this only increased the suspicions around her. Allison and Mark knew the situation was getting out of control. The tension in the city could lead to unpredictable consequences, and they decided to speed up the investigation to prevent further discord in the community. They began to check every detail, every piece of evidence even more carefully, trying to find something that would help them bring the true killer to light. But so far the answers were far away, and suspicions were multiplying. In the shadows of the quiet town, fears lurked and began to surface. More mysteries awaited them ahead, and every step seemed to bring them closer to a solution, but also to new questions. The investigation entered a phase when each new piece of evidence not only did not bring clarity, but also confused the case even more. Allison and Mark felt like they were getting closer to something important, but with every step they realized that this investigation was more complicated than they could have imagined. Each new fact that surfaced seemed contradictory and complicated the overall picture. One of the first problems was that the testimony of witnesses began to differ. Some residents claimed to have seen Maria and Father Daniel together the evening before her death, while others insisted that the priest had already left the church when Maria arrived there. Allison understood that people could make mistakes, but the number of inconsistencies was alarming. Mark decided to go back to the beginning of the investigation and review the evidence collected at the crime scene. He noticed some details that had previously been missed. In particular, he was interested in fingerprints found on the knives and cross used in the murder. It was initially assumed that all the prints belonged to Maria and Father Daniel, but after rechecking it turned out that traces of another person had been found. These prints did not match any of the known suspects, meaning there may have been someone else at the crime scene. The discovery cast doubt on the idea that the priest acted alone and raised questions about a possible accomplice, or even that someone else could have been the real killer. Allison, meanwhile, decided to check the priest's alibi again. She approached parishioners who claimed to have seen him on the day of the murder. Under questioning, one of the witnesses, an elderly man named Henry Wallace, finally admitted that he was not actually sure whether he had seen the priest that evening or not. His initial statement turned out to be the result of pressure from other parishioners who did not want to believe in the possible guilt of Father Daniel. This confession further weakened the priest's position. However, matters became more complicated when Mark found a diary belonging to Mary, which was previously unknown. This diary was hidden in a hiding place under her bed, and its contents were shocking. In it, Maria described her experiences and fears associated with Father Daniel. She wrote that he often approached her with proposals that seemed strange, even threatening to her. In one of her last entries, she mentioned that she was going to tell someone about these proposals but did not specify what exactly was discussed. Allison and Mark began to realize that Maria may have had a secret that she was keeping that could be the reason for her death. But the diary also mentioned a third person who, according to Maria, knew about her plans and tried to stop her. This further confused the situation as it became unclear who exactly Maria trusted and who could be her ally or enemy. Meanwhile, Detectives' attention was drawn to the church's financial records, which showed that large sums of money had been flowing through the church's accounts in recent months, the origin of which was unclear. The money was transferred to the priest's personal account, but its further use was not documented. This discovery forced detectives to think about possible motives related not only to personal relationships, but also to financial interests. Allison also learned that Father Daniel had previously been involved in controversial real estate transactions involving land owned by the church. This might explain the source of the money, but it did not answer the question of how it related to Maria's murder. Each new piece of evidence only increased the number of questions. The case became more and more complicated, and Allison and Mark realized that they needed to find a connection between these disparate facts. They began to suspect that there was something much more behind all this than just personal motives or jealousy. Perhaps it was about a conspiracy in which several people were involved, each of whom had his own interest in the death of Mary. Meanwhile, anxiety began to grow in the city. People no longer knew who to trust. Every new discovery, every new suspicion added fuel to the fire. The community that was once close-knit and friendly began to fragment into groups, each with their own theories and suspicions. Allison and Mark knew that time was against them. They needed to find answers as quickly as possible before the situation got completely out of control. But the deeper they delved into the investigation, the clearer it became that this case was much more complex and dangerous than they could have imagined. As the investigation entered a critical phase, Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway began to realize that there were darker, deeper secrets behind Maria Grayson's death than they could have imagined. The evidence they collected indicated that this crime was not just an act of violence, but the result of many ulterior motives and intrigues intertwined in the lives of several people who, until that moment, seemed infallible. The first key moment came when Allison came across an old folder of documents related to St. Mark's Church. Among the many papers that seemed insignificant at first glance, she found several letters dated more than 10 years ago, which were addressed to Father Daniel. These letters were written by a woman who mentioned her mistake and the unacceptable sin they had committed together. Allison realized that these letters could be related to an event that happened before Father Daniel moved to Ashford. Mark, who was conducting a parallel investigation, discovered another important piece of evidence: a birth record hidden in the hospital's archives, which confirmed that Daniel's father had a son born out of wedlock. This fact was carefully hidden, but as soon as it surfaced, it became clear that this secret could be a serious motive for the murder. Perhaps Maria found out about this, and this put her life in danger. Meanwhile, the church's financial reports continued to reveal new secrets. The money, which was transferred to Daniel's father's personal accounts, was used to finance the construction of a private home in another state. This house, as it turned out, belonged to the same woman who wrote letters to the priest. This discovery revealed that Daniel's father had been in contact with her over the years and may have been trying to hide his connection to his son. All this forced Allison and Mark to once again reconsider their initial assumptions. They now began to suspect that the murder might be part of a wider conspiracy. It is possible that not only Father Daniel, but also other people associated with the church had motives for eliminating Mary, who could reveal these secrets. Allison decided to talk to Amelia Ross, the church secretary, again. She was one of the few who could know about the secrets hidden in the church archives. During the interrogation, Amelia admitted that she had long suspected Daniel's father, that he had connections that he carefully concealed. However, she was afraid to talk about it, since her own position depended on the priest, and she did not want to lose her job and respect in the community. Amelia also mentioned that in recent months, Maria had often asked questions about the church's finances and where the money was going. She seemed to know or suspect something, but did not share her thoughts. Amelia recalled how Maria came to her for the last time a few days before her death, very worried, and said that she needed to discuss something with Father Daniel, but did not specify what. Another important detail was that Amelia noticed on the day when Maria was killed how an unfamiliar man was leaving the church. He was dressed in dark clothes and tried not to attract attention to himself. Amelia did not attach any importance to this at the time, but now this memory began to seem extremely important to her. Allison and Mark began to suspect that this man could be the third person Maria mentioned in her diary. They decided to check CCTV footage from the church area to try to identify him. On one of the cameras, they were able to capture the silhouette of a man entering the church on the evening of the murder. Although his face was hidden, they noticed that he acted extremely cautiously, as if he knew that he might be noticed. Allison and Mark began to suspect that this man could be a hitman or someone who was doing the bidding of Daniel's father. It is quite possible that the priest, afraid of revealing his secrets, decided to remove Mary from his path, but did not want to do it with his own hands. This hypothesis explained many of the contradictions in the case, but so far there was insufficient evidence. All this led to the detectives deciding to return to questioning Daniel's father. They knew he was hiding something important, but they couldn't yet figure out how to get him to talk. They planned to use conflicting evidence and newly discovered evidence to put him in a corner and force him to reveal the truth. Meanwhile, a new wave of rumors and speculation began in the city. The residents of Ashford began to realize that the murder of Maria Grayson was just the tip of the iceberg, and that their quiet town held many more secrets than they could have ever imagined. People no longer felt safe, and mistrust grew every day. Allison and Mark knew they had to act quickly. They had a feeling that someone else might be in danger, and that the killer or his accomplices might strike again if they felt their secrets were about to be revealed. The investigation was nearing its climax, and they were willing to do anything to stop the killer and protect those who might still be in danger. The investigation has reached a boiling point. Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway knew they had to make one last push to tie all the threads together and finally find evidence that could lead to the arrest of the killer. The atmosphere in the city became increasingly tense. Rumors and fears penetrated every corner of Ashford. People were afraid to talk, but at the same time everyone wanted to know what really happened on that fateful night. After long days and nights of evidence analysis and questioning, Allison and Mark returned to the key questions that still remained unanswered. What was Mary's true attitude towards Father Daniel? Who was the stranger seen outside the church on the night of the murder? And what exactly could Mary know that made her a target? Allison, following her intuition, decided to review the surveillance footage again. She managed to find footage that showed a mysterious stranger meeting with Father Daniel in the back of the church hours before Maria was killed. They talked about something for a long time, and although the recording was without sound, it was clear from their gestures that the conversation was tense. This moment was decisive for Allison and Mark. They now knew that the priest not only knew this man, but may have been complicit in his actions. Mark, meanwhile, worked on Daniel's father's financial statements and bank statements. His attention was drawn to a series of transactions involving large sums of money, which the priest transferred to an account registered in the name of a certain Stephen Fletcher. The name was not familiar to the detectives, but after some investigation, they learned that Fletcher was a private detective of dubious reputation, who often did dirty work for those who wanted to remain in the shadows. Allison realized that this Stephen Fletcher could be the same man who was in the church on the night of the murder. Everything pointed to the fact that Father Daniel hired him to get rid of Maria, who could reveal his secret affairs. Now the detectives had to find this Fletcher and get him to talk. They began checking the possible whereabouts of Fletcher, and soon their efforts were crowned with success. Fletcher was spotted at a small motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. Allison and Mark wasted no time in heading there. Their goal was not only to detain him, but also to force him to confess to his participation in the murder. When they arrived at the scene, Fletcher tried to escape, but was unable to escape pursuit. He was caught, and under pressure from the evidence, he began to speak. Fletcher admitted that Father Daniel actually hired him to scare Maria into silence. However, things spiraled out of control when Maria, realizing her life was in danger, tried to escape, and Fletcher killed her in a panic. Fletcher also said that the priest was convinced that Mary had found out about his illegitimate child and illegal financial dealings, and that she was going to tell the public about it. This could ruin his entire career and reputation. so he decided to take extreme measures. Allison and Mark knew they now had what they needed to arrest Daniel's father. They immediately returned to Ashford to fulfill their duty. The arrest took place quietly. The priest did not offer resistance, but his face expressed something more than just fear. It was the realization that his carefully built world had collapsed. As news of his arrest spread throughout the city, Ashford was overcome with a sense of shock and disbelief. People who had believed in Father Daniel's holiness for so long now had to accept the bitter truth. Many could not believe that the person to whom they trusted their souls was capable of such an atrocity. There was one more important part left: the trial. Daniel's father's case was to be an event that would change the life of the city forever. Allison and Mark knew they had a lot of work ahead of them, but now they had a sense of closure. They had finally figured out the complex web of lies and betrayal that led to the murder of Maria Grayson. The trial of Father Daniel McKinnon was an event that split Ashford in two. Some residents could not believe his guilt until the very end, while others felt that justice had finally triumphed. But regardless of opinions, this process was an ordeal for everyone that changed the life of the town forever. The court hearings were tense. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence, including the testimony of Stephen Fletcher, who, despite his own involvement, became a key witness for the prosecution. He spoke in detail about Father Daniel's plans, how he ordered Maria's murder in an attempt to hide his past sins and avoid detection. Evidence of financial fraud and an illegitimate child only strengthened the accusation. Father Daniel, from the very beginning of the trial, maintained a grim silence. Only once, when his lawyer tried to portray him as a victim of circumstance, did he stand up and say that he was ready to accept his fate. This confession was short and dry, without a trace of remorse or regret. Perhaps he understood that his life was already ruined, and further excuses would not help. After long weeks of hearings, the jury reached its verdict. Father Daniel was found guilty of all charges. The sentence was harsh: life imprisonment without parole. This verdict became a kind of point in history that shocked the entire city. Many residents, especially those who believed in the priest's innocence, were shocked, but the truth turned out to be stronger than their faith. Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway, who worked tirelessly to solve this case, could finally breathe out. But along with the sense of accomplishment came the realization of how deeply this investigation had taken a toll on them personally. Allison, who has always prided herself on being objective and professional, realized that sometimes the truth can be too much to bear. Mark, for his part, was deeply moved by how easily people's trust and faith could be destroyed. Life in Ashford changed after the trial. St. Mark's Church, which had once been the center of the city, now stood empty and neglected. Many parishioners stopped attending, and those who remained felt betrayed and empty. The once close-knit community was divided between those who tried to forget what happened and those who could not let go of painful memories. Lisa Carter, Maria's best friend, was also deeply shocked by the incident. She could not forgive herself for not seeing the evil in the priest, even when everything pointed to his guilt. The loss of Maria and the collapse of faith in the person she trusted became too heavy a burden for her. Lisa left Ashford a few months after the trial, trying to start a new life away from the shadows of her past. Amelia Ross, the church secretary, remained in the city, but her life, too, would never be the same. Her involvement in the investigation and subsequent events made her an outcast among the remaining parishioners, who saw her as one of those who helped overthrow their spiritual leader. She, on the other hand, felt relieved knowing that the truth had finally come out, even though it had cost her a lot. John Miller, a local journalist who followed the trial from the beginning, wrote a series of articles about the trial, trying to make sense of all aspects of the case. His materials became popular not only in Ashford, but also beyond. In them, he raised questions about how easily people can turn a blind eye to the truth if it contradicts their beliefs. It was time for change for Ashford himself. A city that once prided itself on being calm and religious is now faced with having to rethink its values. People began to think more about who they chose as their leaders and who they trusted. The recovery process was long and difficult, but gradually the city began to heal its wounds. For Allison and Mark, the case was a lesson they will never forget. They continued their work, but now they considered each new case with even greater caution, knowing that behind each lie there could be much more hidden than it seems at first glance. The story of Maria Grayson, priest Daniel McKinnon, and the town of Ashford is over, but its consequences will be felt for a long time. Not only the tragedy remained in people's memory, but also an important lesson that evil can hide in the most unexpected places, and that the truth, no matter how bitter it may be, must always be found and recognized.